Job's pain-filled grief.
That's Sunday school, yeah. Sunday school is there.
The body of Christ must faithfully minister to those in pain. Today we continue the account of Job following the unspeakable suffering he endured. It begins with his three friends silently sitting with him, but progresses to Job's expression of grief. With the loss of all his possessions, the death of his children, and the physical pain of wounds covering his body, Job concluded it would have been best if he had never been born. At no point did he contemplate suicide. Though his wife said he should curse God and die, Job rejected her foolish advice. He never cursed God, but he did curse the day he was born and wished he had died as an infant. Job expressed raw and honest feelings of anguish and despair. Job is described as the greatest man of the East, the greatest of all men of the East. So he was likely well known in the region. However, when a series of calamities befell Job, only 3 men initially showed up: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamite. Later, a 4th man also came, Elihu, son of Rachel the Buzite. Given that none of the men, including Job, were from tribes or families associated with Judaism, it is likely the book of Job predates the nation of Israel. These men, including Job, believed things had happened to people who deserved it for their sins. This was part of Job's dilemma because he said he had not sinned. How can friends help when you are suffering? People who are suffering often question why it's happening to them. Likely, like Job, we try to comprehend why God is allowing it. When we suffer, we sometimes engage in lamentation talk, which is vocally trying to express our confusion, frustration, or pain. Our questions or comments do not necessarily mean we want our friends to try to provide answers. Yet, when we hear someone questioning their plight, we often feel compelled to respond with an answer. Without feeling what they are feeling, we can provide unfound answers when what is needed may be a healing presence. Instead of speaking, it might be better to weep with them that weep. And that's from Romans 12:15. Okay, first part of our lesson is Job curses the day of his birth, the power of his silence. And it comes from Job. I can find it. There it is. Job chapter 2, verse 11 through 13. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamite. For they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept. And they rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Job is a man on the edge. He is in a precarious position of danger and risk. We are told twice in the intro that Job did not sin. That is, he did not curse God. We will see Job come precariously close. Job is a man in conflict, a man whose state is being sorely tried. He is in conflict with himself, his wife, his friends, and with God. He does not curse God, but he calls God out and challenges God to face him. Job was a man of great importance, the greatest man of the East. As such, the news of his tragedy spread throughout the region. In verse 11, we are introduced to his friends, 3 men from different geographical regions. They could be men of importance in their countries. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were likely sages, that is, wise men who sought to understand the ways of God in light of human experience. They came as loyal friends, and each of them sought to bring his particular wisdom to hear on Job's plight. Eliphaz insists that Job accept his fate. Bildad offers a defense of divine justice. Zophar declares the mysteries of God are incomprehensible. They came to comfort their friend, but they discovered he refused to be comforted. There is a grief so deep it cannot be comforted in this present age. In verse 12, as his friends approached Job, they were unprepared for what they saw. No longer a man of dignity, prestige, and power, Job was wasting away. They could not contain their own grief. They wailed loudly, tore their clothes, and threw dust on their heads. This signifies a sense of solidarity with their suffering friend, whom they believe was under God's judgment. In Ezekiel 27:30, they will make their voice heard because of you. They will cry bitterly and cast dust on their heads. They will roll about in ashes. In verse 13, they sat quietly for 7 days and nights. This was a traditional mourning period for the death of an important person. In other words, they were expecting their friend to die. Here it is helpful to understand the nature of grief. Humans process grief in stages: shock, denial, bargaining, depression, and destruction. Shock and denial leave us in a state of disbelief and numbness. As the numbness wears off, we descend into depression. Depression is sometimes expressed in feelings of guilt and or anger. At some point, we will begin the process of bargaining. This is an effort to regain control or make sense of the loss. We seek to negotiate with ourselves, with family members, or even God. Finally, we come to the place where we try to reconstruct our lives to regain a sense of normalcy. This does not mean we no longer process grief, but that we have learned to live with the emotional pain. As we read through the book of Job, these stages of grief become apparent. At this point, Job and his friends are in shock and disbelief. They are silent for 7 days because no words can express their sorrow. When we are seeking to comfort family members or friends, we are in deep grief. We are often tempted to console them with words. However, comforting words are meaningless when someone is in shock. Job needed his friend's presence. Job and his friends sat in silence because silence is what they needed. They needed time to process their grief. The next part is the pain of suffering. It comes from Job chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. And this opened Job his mouth and cursed his day. And Job spake and said, Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, There is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, that darkness seize upon it. Let it not be joined unto the days of the year. let it not come into the number of the months. Lo, let that night be solitary, let no joyful voice come therein. Let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning. Let the stars of the twilight therein be dark. Let it look for light, but have none, and neither let it see the dawning of the day. Because it shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from thy eyes. After 7 days of silence, 7 is the number of completion, Job broke his silence in a speech filled with rage. Many thoughts, questions, and much confusion must have been going through his mind. Like his friends, Job would have believed that things happen to bad people. But after reviewing his own life, motives, and actions, Job could not discern any reason for his suffering. Therefore, when he started talking, Job let his frustration and anguish flow. In verse 1, Job curses the day of his birth because his suffering has become unbearable. Likewise, his understanding of God has been shaken to the core. He has lived a blameless life and prayed daily for his children, all to no avail. His devotion to God seems futile. In verse 3, not only does he want to die, he wants the day of his birth to perish. He wishes he had never been born. Job does not curse God, nor does he curse himself, nor his parents. But he is on the edge, even leaned over the cliff. But in his deepest depression and fierce anger, he does not cross the line. To do so would be foolish, and Job is no fool. Job's wonderful world has given way to chaos. He directed his rage to all of creation. He declares the order of creation has given way to when the earth was without form and void. In verse 3, instead of the light of day, Job declares darkness of night. In verse 5, instead of abundance of life, Job declares death. In verse 6, he desires that his birthday not be celebrated, but the day of his birth should be stripped from the calendar as if it did not exist. In verse 8, given the severity of his suffering, Job said his birthday should be cursed. Rather than being marked by joy, it should become a day of mourning. His world is void of gladness and filled with sorrow. Creation is not fruitful, but barren. In verse 9, in Job's mind, creation is not good. He desires that even the stars of heaven be darkened, to utter darkness fills the earth. Given his suffering, Job said darkness rather than light was more appropriate. In verse 10, the light of creation led to his birth, which Job lamented, saying it would have been better if his mother had been barren. Job never spoke of taking his own life, but he repeatedly wished he had never been born. In his anger and sorrow, Job is imagining an apocalyptic end to the world he has known. A summary of part 1. After 7 days and nights of silence and trying to understand why this was happening to him, Job was at a loss. With no explanation available, Job could only cry out in pain and suffering, lamenting his very life. The prophet Jeremiah also lamented the day of his birth and wrote an entire book, included in the Bible under the name Lamentations. Sometimes in our pain, we can only groan in the Spirit as God helps us navigate our suffering. Thankfully, the Spirit can turn our groaning into powerful prayers, touching God's heart. Part 2 of the lesson, Job regrets his existence, the struggle of suffering. And this comes from Job chapter 3, 11 through 16. Why did I hide not from the womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Why did the knees prevent me, or why the breast that I should suck? For now should I have lain still and been quiet, I should have slept, then I had been at rest. With kings and counselors of the earth, which built desolate places for themselves, or with princes that had gold who filled their houses with silver, or as a hidden, untimely birth, I had not been, as infants which never saw light. Job is a man afflicted with intense physical pain and mental anguish. He intends his words to affect his demise. Job wants to die. Here he moves from cursing to questioning. The simple question, why, can be so provocative. We are easily tempted to think God is offended when questioned, but God is not offended by our inquiries. Instead, he invites our questions, encouraging us to learn of his way. When I was growing up, we were told to never question God. Therefore, Job's raging dialogue should not be interpreted as faithlessness. Excuse me. He is a man with profound question in need of answers. Job is passionate, dreadfully earnest, and transparently honest. He tells God exactly how he feels and what he thinks. A sentiment and shallow theology will not do. He needs an understanding of God that embraces and makes sense of suffering. In verse 11, Job questions the brutality of human existence. If it is the human plight to suffer, then why be born? A stillbirth is preferable over this kind of life. In verse 12, why should a child be nourished by his mother if it will later starve to death? If tragic suffering is our plight, it would be better for the mother's womb to be a grave and her milk be poisoned. There comes a time when pain and suffering are so intense that death becomes a welcome friend. Job's body is racked with pain and his mind is filled with conflict. He has abandoned hope that life can be meaningful. In verse 13, death is the only answer that appeals to him. In death, he will find that for which he longs, peace and quiet. In verses 14 and 15, he reflects on the tombs of the rich and powerful and prefers the silence of a cemetery over the noise in his mind. The ruins of ancient tombs are to be preferred over houses filled with gold and silver. In verse 16, in Job's suffering, he prefers the day of his death over the day of his birth. He wishes he had never seen light, a metaphor for being hidden away in the darkness of his grave. And I cannot imagine the pain and everything that Job was going through. I don't think I would be able to do it. The deliverance of death comes from Job chapter 3, 17 through 19. There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary be at rest. There the prisoners rest together, they hear not the voice of the oppressor. The small and great are there, and the servant is free from his master. Given that God, Job's wife, and Job himself all asserted Job's integrity, we can rightly conclude that Job said about a person's rest after death is a statement about the death of the righteous, not all people. Part of Job's dilemma was that he and his friends assumed the wicked rightfully suffered, yet Job suffered unimaginable pain and anguish despite maintaining his integrity. He believed, therefore, that his relief from suffering would come in the next life. In verse 17, Job stated the wicked can no longer trouble the righteous in the next life. After a person dies, the tormentors can no longer torment, and the abusers no longer abuse. Death is master over rich and poor, great and small, righteous and wicked. In verse 19, in death the troubles of life cease, the weary are at rest, and slaves are free from oppressors. In this regard, death is a gift from God, which Job will receive with gratitude. Job is on the edge, but stops short of killing himself. He continues to maintain a sense of integrity in spite of his hopelessness, but just barely. Those who study human psychology say the greatest stressor in life are death of a loved one, especially a child, divorce, major illness or tragic injury, or loss of employment and subsequent financial troubles. Job suffered all possible stressors. Most of us have experienced some of these stressors or know someone who has suffered multiple stressors and expressed anger and helplessness. Many of us know someone who suffered so deeply that they opted for suicide. I'm not debating about telling this, but I will. Danny had a friend that they had been friends since school and was in jail in Plymouth. He asked Danny to post his bond and Danny did. He stayed with us that Sunday night. He told Danny that he had gotten 3 speeding tickets for DUI and his ex-wife had hit him with that child support. He said he was not going to jail. He told Danny he wished he was dead. Danny thought it was the after effects of being drunk that was making him talk like he did. Danny told him about God, and his family at the time were members of this church. Danny and his friend went to eat breakfast on Monday morning. His friend had someone come and pick him up and take him home because Danny had to go to work. He told Danny to cherish the growing up of Edward. Danny thought after their conversation everything was going to be all right when his friend left. We got a call Monday afternoon telling us that Danny's friend had taken his life with a shotgun. You never know what we have going on in life that would drive us to do what we do. And I guess if someone tells you that they wish they were dead, it's their way of speaking out that they need help. The story of Job offers wisdom in helping those who suffer deeply. We must allow them to express their pain and suffering and engage them in that conversation. We must listen and speak carefully. Above all, we must never dismiss their anger and depression. We must take seriously all threats against themselves. Okay, the summary of part 2. It said suffering serves a purpose. Suffering loosens our grip upon this life, allowing us to contemplate something better. Suffering can purify and strengthen our faith. Suffering can potentially draw us closer to God as we recognize His presence in our pain. The suffering of Jesus in our place secured our salvation. The Bible says the righteous will suffer, but in Romans 8:18, Paul wrote, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. The last part of our lesson is Job despairs in suffering. The light that lingers. And this comes from Job chapter 3, verse 20 to 23. Wherefore is light given to him that is in misery, and life unto the bitter in soul, which long for death, but it cometh not, and dig for it more than for hid treasures, which rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they can find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hid, and whom God hath hedged in? Despair is born from hopelessness. Job doubled down on his bitterness and misery. He longed for death, but God refused to give it. Ironically, in the heavenly council, God had refused to give Satan power to kill Job. God had power over his life and death. and Job could not understand why God prolonged his days. In verse 20, why was light given? In other words, why would God give a new day filled with bitterness? In verse 21, as a man searches for hidden treasures, Job searched for a grave. In verse 23, Job again asked why life, which was light, was given to a man whose way is hid, meaning someone whose future is uncertain. He added that Job had hedged such a man in. Indeed, God had put a protective hedge around Job, preventing Satan from taking his life. Yet, from Job's perspective, the hedge only prevented him from experiencing relief through death. Job welcomed death, but said God was not granting him this option. It seems to him that God was prolonging his suffering for some mysterious reason, which seemed unreasonable and unfair. Job is the only person in the Bible who suffered such bitterness. Job is not the only person in the Bible who suffered such bitterness. Naomi lost her husband and 2 sons. In Ruth 1:20-21, Naomi lamented, "Do not call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Call me Mara, bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. The Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." When King Hezekiah was informed he would die, he cried out in Isaiah 38:13-15. "I waited patiently all night, but I was torn apart as though by lions. Suddenly my life was over. My eyes grew tired of looking to heaven for help. I am in trouble. Lord, help me." What could I say? For he himself sent the sickness. In these situations, there was no effort to absolve God of accountability. Instead, trusting in God's sovereignty implied hope that the God who takes away will also give. The God who stretches out his hand to afflict will also extend his hand to deliver. The next part is the illusion of security. It comes from Job 23, chapter 3, verse 24-26. "My sighing cometh before I eat, and my roars are poured out like the waters. For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came." When suffering in deep grief, our breathing is affected. It can become very shallow, or we unconsciously hold our breath, and then suddenly we gasp for breath. Job's sighing is a symptom of recurring grief. We are told the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage of their Egyptian taskmasters. In Job's case, God is his taskmaster. In verse 24, Job has lost his appetite. Job's sighs are like the roaring of a lion, coming from deep within and becoming uncontrollable. Job is poured out like the waters. The psalmist expressed Job's condition in Psalm 22:14, "I am poured out like the water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it has melted within me." The metaphors of water and wax, expressive of formlessness, bring out the inner feeling of the anguish. He can no longer function as a human being. The bone, heart, strength, and tongue fail him, not because of any serious diseases, but because of a traumatic experience to be alienated. Job always feared God, which led to his blameless devotion to God. But now he fears God in a different way. He believes he is under attack from God. He believes himself to be under God's judgment for some inexplicable reason. Job is living in dread of a terrible God. Verse 25 is sometimes misinterpreted by people who believe if a Christian is righteous and has enough faith, they will not suffer sickness, disease, or hardship. However, when Job stated, "For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me," he was not claiming a cause and effect relationship with his fears and his suffering. First, he made his statement about his trials began. So this was not a negative confession that led to his suffering. Second, and most importantly, the book of Job tells us why this has happened. And it had nothing to do with Job's fears. Job merely expressed the uncertainty of life itself, saying no one can be certain of what the future holds. In verse 26, Job had done things right, but trouble still found him. There is no ease, no quiet, no rest. His sorrow is multiplied and there is no end. Trouble comes again and again. It is as if Job summons the energy to cry out, "Oh God, please let me die." As the Apostle Paul powerfully stated in 1 Corinthians 15:19, "If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable." Life is rife with uncertainties, but in the midst of it all, there is a rock upon which we can build our faith and our spiritual lives. So when the inevitable storms come, we will continue to stand. In summary of part 3, a lament is an honest and passionate expression of grief and pain. If lamenting our pain and suffering constitutes a negative confession, there is a problem. For an entire book in the Bible is titled Lamentations. Further, several other psalms are filled with lament. However, most biblical lamentations bring the comments and observations full circle with a testimony of God's grace and power to deliver us. In closing, David declared in Psalms 25:8, "God and good and upright is the Lord." However, in the face of suffering, we are sometimes tempted to question the goodness of God. The story of Job presents a different aspect of faith in which we are forced to acknowledge we cannot always understand the ways of God. God's goodness transcends our experiences of evil. With 24-hour cable news cycles, we are bombarded with stories of warfare, disaster, and calamities the world over. We become desensitized to sorrow. Job refuses to allow us to be desensitized. He demands that we look intently in the face of suffering and ask serious questions. If we cannot explain it, at the least we should not ignore it. Some people have suffered tragedies so traumatic that they will never overcome the grief. Outside of a miracle, they will live the rest of their lives with traumatic memories and nightmares that trigger waves of sorrow. It is not that they choose to live this way, they cannot control it and they are overwhelmed by it. We have a name for this, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Their entire lives have been disordered by trauma. And this can be from the soldiers to just an everyday person. From a Christian worldview, this present age is filled with tribulation and many tears. The only conflict is that we await a new creation in which there will be no more pain or sorrow. Thank you all for coming.